Hey everybody, today I had an idea to make a little discussion video talking about what makes a good spiritual successor for Chrono Trigger. And what brought this to my attention in the first place this morning was something classic talking about, or actually posting a question, what are the top 5 things that make a game a spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger? And I know that I've already kind of belabored the point of what is a spiritual successor. This is really kind of more of a thought experiment, though, about what it is exactly that an indie developer could do in order to make a successful spiritual successor, both from my perspective and then more broadly as well. Sit back, enjoy some of the vibes. I've been working really hard on this little part of the studio here, so I hope you enjoy it. I went ahead and said that I think that to be a true spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger, you really have to have some time travel shenanigans. Which is one of the things that I feel like Chrono Cross failed in. And I hate to say that it failed, but it really omitted this key aspect of Chrono Trigger that made it feel less like a actual follow-up to Chrono Trigger and more like, I don't know, I mean, the dimension travel thing is kind of neat, and it is fallout from the initial time travel shenanigans of the first, but it did not feature actual time travel in the classical sense, and I think that that kind of sucks. I really enjoyed Chrono Cross, but I know that it's not a universally beloved game like Chrono Trigger was. So as a result, I think that that's one of the things that really probably should have been included, and that includes being able to recruit a bunch of characters from across various timelines. That's, I think, one of the really cool things about Chrono Trigger is being able to go back to 600 AD and get Frog, and then being able to go back to or forward to 1000. No, no, 2000. No, gosh, what was the era? The far future, and get Robo and uh, yeah, like I like being able to get people from across time. A real Bill and Ted's Adventure kind of scenario. Getting people from across time, recruit them for a common goal, probably saving the world. I feel is pretty integral to the vibe of Chrono Trigger. So as a result, I would definitely encourage the inclusion of something like that. And then also being able to exploit the paradoxes inherent in time travel. Chrono Trigger did this weird, funny thing where they explained the grandfather paradox in the very beginning. They had this whole scene built out, showing and explaining the reasons why it's important to go and rescue Marl, because if we don't, then Queen Ling gets killed, and then her daughter doesn't happen, then her daughter doesn't happen, and then Marl doesn't get created. Get created. She isn't born, and then they go through all these pains to talk about these paradoxes that could come from this, the grandfather paradox. You go back in time, you kill your grandfather. How did you do it? Because you can't exist, right? Um, so the way that Chrono Trigger kind of covered this initially was kind of funny because they promptly ignore that then, because of a lot of other things that you can do throughout the world do create those paradoxes. But one of those things we'll talk about a little bit later on about the side stories. I will get to those. But one of the things that I like being able to do is manipulate the order in which you open certain kinds of special treasure chests that were locked, and being able to, as a result, get multiple of the same items or get more powerful versions of the same items from various locations. Because you get something from the future, and then you go back like 1,000 years and you get it again, then you have 2 of these items. That's a paradox. But Chrono Trigger just lets you get away with it at that point, which is why I think it's so funny that they talk about time travel paradox and the grandfather paradox, because it just promptly ignores the whole fallout of that. And it doesn't have to be internally consistent. There's a few things that are red herrings when it comes to talking about the spiritual successors and making a spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger. And one of those red herrings is probably being internally consistent. And by that I mean plot holes. I mean, there's plenty of plot holes in Chrono Trigger. Let's be real. Chrono Trigger is not a masterful work of fiction. It's a masterful JRPG. But as far as works of fiction go, there are plot holes, there are loopholes, there are paradoxes in time travel. That doesn't keep it from being an absolutely fantastic RPG. Obviously, it is considered one of the best of all time. So that's why I'm saying that being internally consistent, making it a masterful work of fiction, not exactly integral to being a good spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger. Now, I mean, if you wanted to make something that was absolutely incredible from start to finish, from a story perspective, internally consistent, some real high fantasy style RPG, you could do that and it would probably be great, but it's not required. And also, I think on the subject of internally consistent works of masterful fiction, let's also recognize the fact that maybe in Japan, Chrono Trigger is a masterful work of fiction from start to finish, written and internally consistent. It's high fantasy, maybe, but the localization process maybe left something on the table. I don't know, because I don't speak Japanese, and chances are pretty good that you don't either. Branching paths, I think, are pretty important to an extent, and I'll talk a little bit about why it's only to an extent eventually. But one of the things that I really liked from Chrono Trigger is the ability at a certain point to either recruit or kill a character. This has been out for 18 years? No. Let's see. 1996 in the United States, maybe 95. So that's 19 years, 18, 19 years. If you haven't played Chrono Trigger yet and you haven't had it spoiled for you already, skip ahead 10 seconds. Magus. Yeah, when you can either recruit or kill Magus. That's the one that that I think was just really inherently like a turning moment in the game for me, that split in the path. And I really liked that you could go either way with it at that point in the game. And I think that being able to carry that forward to some extent, uh, you know, kind of like Vegeta in Dragon Ball Z, right? There's something about that that just is from the era, from the times, that just feels really integral to being a RPG inspired by Chrono Trigger. It doesn't necessarily have to be that exact scenario, of course, uh, but yeah, I feel like that's a big pillar. Being able to make a big choice that affects your party in a big way. Chrono Cross, though, did this a little bit differently. Do I need a spoiler warning, Chrono Cross? Yeah, skip ahead 30 seconds. It's Kid and Glenn. At a certain point, you have to say, I don't know how to rescue Kid in order to get the best character in the game, Glenn. And that always really kind of bugged me, and I didn't like having to pick between two characters or seemingly pick between two characters in order to get my favorite character. That said, even that sequel did a pretty similar job of giving you some kind of choice, whether you knew it or not, that would result in whether or not you get this really cool other character that obviously you want. So yeah, Chrono Cross did it a little bit differently, but the fact that it did it at all, it actually featured that quite a bit. In fact, maybe not just that one character I just mentioned, but throughout, there's a lot of decisions that you make that affect which character you do or do not get. I think they went a little heavy with that. I think Chrono Cross in general went really heavy with a lot of too many choices about which characters you can get, resulting in characters that were really well developed potentially being skipped, or characters who were very underdeveloped being thrust into your party because of an unwitting choice. So I don't mean to use Chrono Cross so often as a point of comparison. I think it's a useful point of data that shows what the developers thought was integral to the existence of Chrono Trigger in its first iteration and what they wanted to bring forward. And I think that that also speaks some volumes about what exactly is important. I also think that there should be some character-specific side quests. In Chrono Trigger, every character that you had in your party has a character-specific side quest that does a couple of really important things. And one of those is the fact that it's a side quest dedicated to character development of that character. If you just play the game and you don't actually do those side quests, you miss a lot. Like, you end up with a very different experience where the characters feel kind of bland. They might feel kind of stereotypical, and I think that even though you do the side quests, they still don't feel extremely well fleshed out. I mean, we have mythology, we have mythologized these characters over time as a result of having played the games over and over and over because they are so fun to play. But I don't feel like any of the characters have unexpected depth at this point. Maybe for the time they did. Because again, this was 20 years ago when this game came out. Oh my gosh, it is now 2025. Happy New Year. I know that a lot of what I'm saying here is going to sound like sacrilege to some very die-hard fans, but that's because I'm trying to take games off of pedestals. You don't want to overhype a game for people who haven't played them, and you got to be kind of realistic and pragmatic sometimes about the realities of the games that you enjoy. Is Chrono Trigger the best JRPG of all time? Yeah, possibly. Probably. It's definitely up there, but it's still there despite everything that I have to say about it. Okay, fine. My camera sees my hand gestures and it just wants to follow me. So, okay, whatever. So yeah, character-specific side quests, they definitely added some character depth to these characters. And I think that for better or worse, that allows you to maybe only invest in the characters that really speak to you personally. And that's cool. But if you don't, then you're left with only seeing some of the characters that that you chose to play as, or you stumbled into, or maybe you followed a guide and you got them all. But there's a good chance that some people skipped all of those side quests and didn't realize it and came away with a pretty different experience. That is the other edge of this double-sided sword. That cuts both ways. It could be a good thing, but it could leave out some really cool stuff for certain kinds of players. Being able to experience things differently, though, gives everybody a novel experience, gives everybody like something to talk about. Oh, when I played, I did this thing. Oh, I should try that next time I play through it. Maybe that's one of the things that makes Chrono Trigger so replayable. And one of those great things about these side quests is you can also get player-specific or character-specific end gear loot. But the other issue with that is that then these are all placed right at the tail end of the game. Anyways, I do think that character-specific side quests that give them special character-specific loot, that's a solid way to be. One of those things that I also really like about them is that these also lean into some of those time-traveling shenanigans that I mentioned earlier, creating paradoxes. So I'm going to talk about the side quest for Luca here for a second. So if you're afraid of spoilers for this 20-year-old game and you haven't been spoiled already, skip ahead a minute. But the fact that like Luca in the past watched her mother become crippled by this machine that just destroys her legs, being able to go back in time through some sort of convenient plot device, MacGuffin, and then change that is really awesome. Being able to change the past in order to affect the future, that is again a paradox, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be internally consistent. The rule of cool, it trumps all, essentially. Rule of cool. If it's cool, you can do it, even if it breaks the rules of the universe, because at the end of the day, Chrono Trigger, it's a shonen JRPG. And we all loved it at the time because we were the target audience. And if you can't see that at this point, well, just give it a little reflection. It was made for kids of a certain age. We were of that age. And I feel like spiritual successors to Chrono Trigger will also maybe try and target people of that age, or give us vibes of that age. We're not looking for the most well-developed characters necessarily. I mean, Chrono was a silent protagonist. He had no personality, and that's okay. That is okay to acknowledge that fact. Now, I will say also, bonus points if one of those side quests and end game character loot results in the ability to reforge a mystical evil slaying sword, aka the Masamune, the Einlanzer, the Master Sword, anything like that. It's not a requirement, but bonus points. I love that stuff. Now, let's talk about some of the other red herrings. I mentioned one of them already, and that's just trying to be a internally consistent work of fiction. We're not trying to recreate Brandon Sanderson's anything. Man, Stormlight Archives, I just finished, or I'm on the cusp of finishing the last book that he just put out. It's so good. I highly recommend it. But anyways, yeah, we're not creating like masterful works of fiction here when we create RPGs necessarily. You can, but it's not a requirement. But I think it also bears mentioning at this point, I'm not an expert. I'm not the lore keeper of Chrono Trigger, or I've never designed an RPG. I did go to video game design school once, which is why I work in the tech industry now as something completely different. Yep, went to school for video game art and design, but I am not an authority. In fact, I think the only people who really can be authorities at this point are developers. Speaking of which, I'll link to Something Classic's Twitter post, their poll, because I think that if you have thoughts, that's a really good place for you to put them, as well as the comments down below. But yeah, here's the things that I think seem like requirements, but maybe aren't. And the top one is gorgeous pixel art. Now, this is obviously a plus. Like, yeah, you can have absolutely gorgeous pixel art, but is it a requirement to be a spiritual successor? Not necessarily. Even Chrono Cross, again, did not have pixel art. It went polygons. And you could hypothetically have a polygonal RPG that's inspired by and attempts to succeed, Chrono Trigger. The Dream Team is not coming back together. Too many people who were involved in the original are no longer involved, and or can no longer be involved, like Akira Toriyama, rest in peace. Phenomenal creator, phenomenal artist, and yeah, he's no longer able to be a part of this. So as a result, there could be some creators from the Dream Team involved. That would be nice, but at this point, I think it's too far gone. We're probably not going to see Squaresoft. I mean, Squaresoft doesn't even exist anymore. Square Enix, I don't think that they are going to touch this series at this point. It's too mythologized. So it has to be people. It has to be, in this case, indie devs trying to take up the mantle, so to speak. And I hope that someday we get something that will appeal to you as well. We've had several spiritual successors to Chrono Trigger at this point. And again, I've already kind of belabored this point in another video. So, gorgeous pixel art, it's a huge plus, but I don't think it has to necessarily be that way. Turn-based combat with character combos. Honestly, I'd be happy to see an action RPG that is inspired by Chrono Trigger. I think that would be sick. Turn-based combat, sure, it feels pretty integral to Chrono Trigger as its own thing. I think, though, that it originally wasn't even planned to be a turn-based RPG necessarily. There's a couple of games that kind of got split out from this initial endeavor, and I think one of those ended up becoming Secret of Mana. I didn't really research this before the video, so my details on this are hazy, but as I recall, there was originally one game in development that was going to be made for the Nintendo PlayStation, I think, and it got split into a couple of different games, perhaps 3 different games, but I only remember Chrono Trigger and Secret of Mana being one of them, and I believe that Secret of Mana, well, or this original game was going to be an action RPG, kind of like Secret of Mana, and that is a pretty clear indication that this doesn't necessarily have to be, although it can be, and it would be cool if it was, it doesn't have to be a turn-based RPG. Red Herrings is visuals that look like Akira Toriyama's designs. I mean, maybe this is some of my own mythologizing going on here, but how do you even follow an act like Akira Toriyama? Instead, I think what's important is a distinctive art style. Something that might be shonen anime style of art would be cool, but it doesn't really have to be. It doesn't require that. And then music that sounds like Yasunori Mitsuda. Again, it doesn't have to be Mitsuda. And it's also not just Mitsuda who worked on Chrono Trigger. It was also Nobuo Uematsu. I think they tag teamed this one. Mitsuda kind of took the lead on the creation of the music behind Chrono Trigger, but his wild jazzy vibes and things were tempered by the skilled and practice and kind of mentored throughout this by Uematsu. It doesn't require his involvement. It's cool if it does, but it's most likely at this point not going to, because these guys are retiring, you know? Of course you want good compositions. It's a nice nod if you can swing it. I don't think it's a requirement. Next up, multiple endings. You know, this is something that I think a lot of people will think is inherently required for a spiritual successor. I know that this is something that a lot of people feel really passionate about, the multiple endings thing. And maybe having multiple endings is good for some people, but I'm kind of a little bit over throwing myself into doing all of the things in order to get the best ending. I'll still do it, especially for the games that I love the most, like the Trails games, but I don't love that sometimes those best endings are locked away behind so many extra tasks, mini games, that sort of thing. If one ending is better, just a nicer, more complete ending in the first place, if that's the canon ending, then what's the point of including the other endings? I could see maybe having some endings like added on, giving an extended ending as a reward for doing extra things. That's cool. But I don't like the sort of endings where, like, oh, you missed this archaic thing and now you have this bad ending. Shame on you for not playing our game to its fullest. I don't love that. Ultimately, I feel like that sort of thing is not the best. So yeah, multiple endings can be nice. I like the idea, though, of having customized endings based on what you did do. That's cool, but not being locked away behind a bad ending if you missed or skipped something important. Because if somebody does that, honestly, it says more about the game developer than it does the player, I think. Other notes. This is different from red herrings and such. And that's, I wouldn't be afraid to bring something new to the table. Don't be afraid to be unique and to do something unexpected. If you are an indie developer and you want to make a Chrono Cross or Chrono Trigger spiritual successor, don't just make Chrono Trigger again. We've played Chrono Trigger. It's the best Chrono Trigger. Make something that is different from just Chrono Trigger, because honestly, if you're going to announce to people that you're making a Chrono Trigger spiritual successor, people are going to hate you. They're going to hate it, and they're going to hate you out of spite. Because how dare you attempt to encroach on Chrono Trigger's territory? People are kind of weird like that. And it's not you, it's them. It's something they need to work on. So they're going to hate you anyway. So you may as well make a game that you want to make that brings something new to the table. Chrono Trigger, when they were making Chrono Trigger, they didn't set out to maybe make the best JRPG ever made. Well, I mean, to an extent, aren't we all? Every time you make a new game, every time you make a video, every time you make a fireplace, you want to make the best one ever. The best version of what you can make, right? You want to push yourself, but you want to bring a part of you to the table when you do that. So, yeah, don't be afraid to bring something new to the table and expand and do something just completely different, because someone's going to take issue with you anyway. Anytime you make something unique or interesting or artful in general, there's going to be somebody who takes offense or takes issue or would say, I would do something different if I was them. But the fact that you're trying and that you're doing something is more important. What's interesting is how many people will criticize a work of art or a work of anything and then go on to make nothing and contribute nothing to art and culture ever. Perhaps because they put art and culture on such a lofty pedestal that they are frozen by indecision or frozen by the fear of rejection that they dole out so quickly. This is something that applies to so many forms of art. Hypothetically, you could make a piece of art that is universally liked, but I don't think you can make a work of art that is universally loved. Like, you can make something that everybody thought was, oh, that's all right. But then as soon as you start making creative choices and start doing something unique with that, that's when you're going to start getting people who hate you. And I don't think you should let that dissuade you from your artistic choices. Bold decisions get bold responses, and art should get bold responses from people. You want to make people feel something, right? So that's my recommendation, is get haters. Yeah, I think it's okay to get haters. It's a sign that you're probably on the right path. Yeah. This is some interesting internal, because I'm thinking of all kinds of facets of art, not just creating a spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger, and I'm finding some new truths as I just kind of mentally walk through some of this. So yeah, I can apply this to myself, I think. Also, in tandem with this, a good spiritual successor, like a good sequel or remake, should not be held back by the original. Now, how do you incorporate this when you're talking about making a spiritual successor to the greatest JRPG of all time? Well, you start by taking it off a pedestal and you recognize, while it might be the most beloved JRPG of all time, it still has its detractors. There are some things that I mentioned earlier that that people say that they hate about certain RPGs, that they'll turn a blind eye for Chrono Trigger. You gotta try to clear your eyes. You gotta take the games down from pedestals. You gotta hype them responsibly and hype yourself responsibly as well. Hype your own game responsibly, because overhyping it by telling everybody that it is a spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger is a good way to get everybody super not on board with you. So maybe hold those cards close to the chest, be inspired by them, but maybe don't make that your primary selling point. I would say that is a double-edged sword as well. Again, that's a whole thing that I talked about in depth in my video talking about what is a spiritual successor. Another red herring before I get to my final point. I do have one more. Being the best RPG ever made. You don't have to make the best JRPG ever made in order to be a good spiritual successor to Chrono Trigger. The best ever made, it's very, very subjective, and no one is going to universally agree on that. Don't go chasing waterfalls. Don't go chasing perfection. Great is the enemy of good. Something that is released and finished is better than something perfect that never comes out. At some point, you got to know when to stop gilding the lily. When you've hit the 80-20 rule, when releasing it is good enough. Chrono Trigger itself is a result of a project that got too big, and they split it into a few different projects, a couple different projects, and they rescoped things, and it turned out fabulously. They did not accomplish their original vision. Most RPGs, most games, most pieces of art don't ever hit their full vision, their whole what they're going for. So get as close as you can, as quickly as you can within the scope, within the funds that you have to work with. Don't go making the same mistake that Xenogears made. Again, another beloved classic that ended up having to adjust their scope. And because it happened so late in the game, it wasn't able to happen very gracefully. And there are some people who take issue with every time I talk about Xenogears, because it is, an immaculate game from start to finish, perfect. No, nothing wrong ever was done or said about Xenogears. The game is perfect, immaculately conceived. That game made some choices. That game made some bold choices, and as a result, it's made a lot of people really love it, and it made some people not love it. And while I'm not a hater of Xenogears, it did get some ire because it made some bold choices, and maybe some of those were mistakes, maybe not. So yeah, don't get downtrodden trying to make the best RPG ever made. That's a red herring. And then the final discussion point about this that I really wanted to say is that this might be a bold choice for me to say this. There's never been an actually failed spiritual successor as long as the creators of that game were actually inspired. Because ultimately, that is the one and true only requirement to be a spiritual successor to a game, is to be inspired by it. I think that that's all right. I think that's enough. Just know your inspirations, know what you liked about it, and acknowledge that if you want to, but you don't have to use it as a basis for a game necessarily. We put the term spiritual successor up on a pedestal as well, because you're announcing your intentions to make a game like this other game. And that can work for you, it can work against you, but ultimately, what it all comes down to in the end is, were you inspired by the original? And how did you follow that? How did you allow that to affect your decisions? And that's all there is to it. So go out there, make your spiritual successors if you want to. Declare them as spiritual successors or inspirations by the different development studios out there that you're inspired by. Do what you want to do. Ultimately, that's what it all comes down to, is make the game you want to make, and have fun. Make art, make choices, be bold, and make haters, get fans. But hey, these are just my own personal thoughts on making a Chrono Trigger spiritual successor. And I know that everybody watching, if you're still here, this has gone on pretty long, but if you're still here, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below about what makes a good spiritual successor, and go check out the Something Classic tweet and respond to their survey, and we'll see what happens. Anyways, I'm SuperDerek. Have a good rest of your day, everybody.